Hi, first grade. It's Mrs. Thomas back with some more of our read aloud from Flat Stanley. If you remember in chapter 1, we met Flat Stanley. We learned how he became flat from that accident with the corkboard. And then in chapter 2, we learned about how his parents had a great idea of how to get him to California to visit his friends on a vacation. Who remembers how they got him to California? Wasn't on an airplane because Dad said that was too expensive. Well, how'd they do it? I heard someone say, you're right. They put him in a really big envelope, lots of stamps on top, and they mailed him. And then, when his vacation was over, his friends did the exact same thing. They put him back in a really big envelope, put some more stamps on it, and then mailed him home. Chapter 3 we'll read today is called Stanley the Kite. And I'm actually outside today. I don't know if you can tell, but today would be a great kite flying day. So we'll read chapter 3 now. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was different when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Why might it be easier to walk about the city after Stanley became flat, do you think? Call it out if you have a guess. Ooh, I heard some great guesses. Let's read on to see. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, which is like a package, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. So if you look there, he kind of rolled them up almost like a sleeping bag, and then he held on to him, and then he could hold his brother's hand on the other side. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One afternoon in the street they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper, Mr. Jones said. Going to decorate your house, I suppose? Wallpaper? Said Mr. Lambchop. Oh no, this is my son, Stanley. He untied the string and Stanley unrolled. How do you do? Stanley said. Nice to meet you, young feller, the man said. George, he said to Mr. Lambchop, that boy is flat. So he unrolled himself. You can see he's still rolled up the back of him, his legs, and he's shaking hands with his father's friend. Smart too, said Mr. Lambchop. Stanley is third from the top in his class at school. Phewie, said Arthur. This is my younger son, Arthur, Mr. Lambchop said, and I bet he will apologize for his rudeness. Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on their way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So encyclopedias are sort of like dictionaries almost. They give you research and facts and information. People don't use them as much now because they have Google and things like that on the internet, but people before the internet would have to look in encyclopedias to find out all that information and those facts. So he piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. Put some more on me, Arthur said. And then I forgot to show you, but that's the picture of them walking home in the rain, and his brother Arthur is getting soaking wet. And he looks mad. Look at that scowl he has on his face. He is not happy. When he saw them, don't stand there, help me. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. So there he is. He's trying to put all those heavy books on him. Why do you think that is? What do you think? I heard someone say it. He's jealous. You're right. He's trying to make himself flat so he could be like his big brother. Who here has a little brother or sister that's always trying to copy them or be like them? That happens at our house. Molly's forever trying to do what Olivia does. They spoke to Stanley. Arthur can't help being jealous, they said. Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all. The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Someday, he said, I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite-flying contest and be famous like everybody else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Oh, he's feeling a little glum. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur, he said. Come on. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways, to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him. There's him flying like a kite. So that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long, matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably nobody will ever again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string. There he is eating his hot dog. The wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet. And then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. So there he is. Can you see? Stuck in the tree. There's like a little squirrel looking at him. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Does anyone know what cross means? Yeah, angry or mad. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. You're at the office all day having fun, she said. You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult. Kids are like that, Mr. Lambchop said. Phases. Be patient, my dear. And that is the end of chapter 3. Next time we read together, we will read chapter 4, which is called The Museum Thieves. So it gets a little interesting in chapter 4. All right, I'll see you next time for more Flat Stanley. Bye.